Lifting heavy weights and medieval fantasy. Two of my favorite things. Not surprising, I'm sure, considering all the videos I've made running around the mountains dressed in 11th century clothing lifting rocks. The question I've been trying to answer for a long time now is, how can I combine the two? Possibly the single most asked question I get, aside from how much you bench. Just kidding, I don't actually get that one. The most common question is, have you or will you train with a steel mace or club bells? Up until now, my answer has always been, no, but I plan on it. Well, I was thinking about that recently and it hit me. I found it, the link between fitness and wandering the mountain forests in medieval garb. I don't have a mace, but what I do have is a heavy training sword. There it is, I'll just swing the sword. So that's what I did, every day for 5 days straight. Much more since then too, by the way. Hint, this stuff works. First, some history. The thing that stood out most to me when I went searching is how old mace and club training actually is. There's evidence suggesting this stuff was used for training 1,000 to 1,500 years ago at the very least, probably long before that. Who can say the timeline for a club being used as a weapon? That's prehistory. It doesn't take much to realize a heavy stick can cause a lot of damage. Thousands of years of history and tradition. I quickly realized there's no way I could do that any justice in a single video. So just to summarize, there are different variations of these things, clubs and maces of varying shapes and sizes and weights, each with their own specialty, strength, mobility, muscle, strength, endurance, all of the above, and considering they've lasted so long, there's no question about it, they obviously work. There are many different movements you can do with a mace, but the one that's always stood out to me, the one I've seen most often, is the basic swing over the head, or the 360, or the shield cast, so that's what I tried to replicate. I know there is some nuance to each variation, and I'm sure there are subtle differences between the things I just said that I don't yet understand. I just went into the experiment with the general idea that I'd swing the sword around my head. I realize these days these tools aren't necessarily used for martial arts training, at least not exclusively, but it's clear that's where they started. If you use a mace or a club in battle, it only makes sense to practice with a mace or a club before battle so you're prepared. The exercises mimic attacks, which is something I kept in mind during this experiment. Swords and maces are inherently different. A mace is a blunt weapon that relies on strength and momentum, allowing its wielder to generate a lot of power with the aim of hitting something really hard. And I don't mean to say you can't be graceful with a mace, but you need to have some force behind a mace attack, especially against an armored opponent. The weight distribution is set up to allow for this. Most of the weight is in the head of the mace. The balance point is at the very end of the weapon, allowing you to leverage its weight to cause damage. A sword, on the other hand, is sharp. You don't need to swing it with all that much force to get the job done. The balance point for a sword is also closer to the hilt. It depends on the type. One meant primarily for thrusting might have the balance point a bit further back near the handle, whereas a sword meant for slashing might balance an inch or two past the hilt down the blade, but generally a sword should feel balanced in your hands, unlike a mace, which is purposefully unbalanced. Because of this, the mechanics are different between the two. There is much more core engagement needed when swinging a mace, and I accept that. A sword won't give the exact same benefits a mace or club would. That said, I just think swords are awesome, and by the end of this experiment, I felt a lot more confident holding one, which was the original point with this stuff in the first place, becoming more efficient with your weapon. I know not everyone is like this, but this is how I like to view things. If I'm doing something cool, I like to think in terms of improving the thing, not in terms of how the thing translates to fitness. When you see me doing the sandbag to shoulder, for example, I'm not thinking about how it's gonna build muscle and everything else. I'm focused on how badass it is to have the strength to throw a heavy, awkward object weighing much more than I do up onto my shoulder. This was how I approached the experiment. Fitness and muscle and mobility and everything else aside, I just wanted to get better at swinging the sword, because I think it's cool. Kind of a tangent, but I think this actually leads to better fitness gains down the line anyway. When you put those fitness things on the back burner and focus on actually improving what you're working on, the gains just show up one day. Muscle and strength gain is a slow process, and I figure if I'm gonna take the time to learn a skill, even if the desired end result is muscle and strength in addition to that skill, I might as well enjoy learning while I'm doing it. If I wanted to hyper-focus on muscle, I'd just go sit on a machine, but skills are fun, and also give you muscle. Back to the sword. When you see a longsword in a video game, it's typically ultra heavy and slow moving, but that's not at all what it's like in the physical world. A longsword typically weighs between 4 and 7 pounds, nothing like the giant swords from Elden Ring, for example. The sword I used for this experiment was modeled after a hand-and-a-half sword, which is typically a bit smaller than a longsword, and is meant to be used with either 1 or 2 hands, unlike a true longsword, which is typically used with both hands. If I had an actual good sword, I don't think this experiment tournament would have worked nearly the same, but the one I got is a poor representation of what a sword should be. It's heavy, and the balance point is pretty far down the blade, making it into something of a hybrid between a good sword and a club in terms of balance. I say this because while I know the sword didn't give me everything a mace or club might have, it still felt more than heavy enough, and I was able to get some good momentum going, like you'd get when swinging a mace. Final thing I'll say, because the sword felt easier to maneuver than a heavy mace, at least I imagine the mace would take more effort, I went for volume, hundreds and probably thousands of reps each day. In this next part, I'll go through the notes I left for myself. I tried to expand on a few things, but this section will be brief and to the point. I'll get to my thoughts on everything after. Day 1. The first day, I honestly had no idea what I was doing. My form was sloppy and I was just figuring it out. I went for about a half an hour, including moving the camera around, and I knew right away I was in for it. My shoulders and traps were on fire almost instantly, and my forearms felt like they doubled in size from the pump. Usually when you get sore from something, you feel it the next day, but every once in a while something hits so hard you're sore after only an hour or two. That's what happened to me on this day. I typically like the soreness that comes from training, but this was one of those times where it just hurt. The entire area from below my armpits up to my neck all the way around was shot. It was that type of soreness that almost frightens you a bit. Sort of like if you ever had night terrors as a child and you wake up and there's this strange feeling of not quite knowing what's going on. All you know is for some reason you feel a bit disoriented. It was sort of like that. Saying that now after the fact, it sounds kind of extreme. Maybe it also had something to do with me acclimating to the higher elevation, but that's how it felt. Surprisingly, the soreness was for the most part gone by the next morning, but that first night was intense. I think that alone was enough to tell me everything I needed to know. This stuff works. Day 2. I woke up with wrist to elbow soreness on the back sides of my forearms, any movement of the wrist and I could feel it. I spent more time practicing, still wasn't really sure what I was doing, but I had fun going through the motions. My shoulders and traps were stiff when I started, but a couple minutes and I regained all mobility. That night, same intense soreness, but less debilitating, or perhaps I was just getting used to it. Day 3. I realized I wasn't doing a real 360. I was only doing the movement part way, so I started trying to rotate around my body more, slowly improving but still figuring it out. The extra emphasis on rotation caused what was probably the craziest shoulder pump I've ever had. Day 4. Shoulders incredibly sore from the extra range of motion I added, definite improvement. On this day, I started trying to be more powerful with it, swinging faster and then stopping that force as abruptly as I could. I worked on getting the core involved more in the movement too. Improvements again, but still a long way to go. Day 5. Shoulders and traps and forearms still sore, obliques also sore from the extra rotation, beginning to feel mobility improvements. I usually spend a while warming up my shoulders before a workout, but I felt ready to go straight away. Looking back at the footage from this day, it looks pretty much the same as every other day, but it felt completely different from day 1. More core engagement, more range of motion, and more power with every swing. Results. I realize 5 days isn't nearly enough to see real changes to the body, but I do believe it was enough to see where this road leads. The first benefit was shoulder mobility and muscle. The sword swinging forces your shoulders to move in a way you're probably not used to if you only ever train using typical gym equipment. It takes the shoulders through their complete range of motion. It's like what Eric Bugenhagen talks about with shoulder training. I remember way back he showed these wrestling curls he'd do that were half curl, half shoulder circles. He's also mentioned that he built his shoulders while recovering from a knee injury by mimicking swimming motions with light dumbbells. I think swinging the sword is just a more badass version of that. I do believe there's much more to training the shoulders than just lifting your arms to the front or the sides or pressing overhead. A ball and socket joint can go every which way, so why limit yourself to just a few motions? I have no doubt practicing with a sword or mace or club like this will lead to increased muscle size given enough time. Mobility ties into that too. It's like a constant positive loop. The more mobility you gain, the more range of motion you have available, the more potential for muscle there is, and so on, and that carries over to everything, gym training and beyond. I noticed an improvement in the amount of force I was able to generate and control by the end. These swinging exercises teach your body to work as one solid unit. They require total body coordination. This will carry over to anything where coordination is required. The more time you spend teaching your body to move in the most optimal ways, the better you get at it, and these shield cast exercises let you get a lot of reps in. I also felt a noticeable improvement in my mind-muscle connection with my core. I made a video a while back about how high-rep ab training makes it easier to brace for heavy lifting because it improves that mental connection, letting you brace everything in 360 degrees, making you feel more solid. The Sword 360 move seems to work in the same way, possibly even better. I can imagine this would be amplified even more with an actual mace or club. The final improvement I noticed was with my grip. I use grippers before sandbag workouts as a way to wake myself up. I've always felt a connection between my hands and that deep-rooted central nervous system power for some reason. I found the grippers help me tap into that aggressive place needed for lifting sandbags. Well, since I started this experiment, I feel like I have complete control over those grippers. Like my grip just seems more complete. I think this surprised me the most, though I know it shouldn't have. Swinging a sword is basically endless grip training for the hands, and it works the forearms from every direction too, which leads to even more grip strength. Bigger, stronger, and more mobile shoulders, mass added to the traps and forearms, a strong core, and a better mental connection with it, improved grip strength. Needless to say, this is a form of exercise I plan on continuing. For now with a sword, eventually with other implements as well. If you like this video, consider checking out my book, Sandbag Hypertrophy, over on Amazon, link below. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.